What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. As is typical of new metagames, there is not a consensus as to what the best deck in the game is right now. There's a lot of open contendership for that top spot, and I think the best place to start when you're in a relatively open meta is with a deck that a ton of people are playing. We're going to start with this one. It's the baseline, in my opinion, Galacta Penny Parker deck. If you see those cards, you can think it's probably going to be this. If it's not this, it might be a Wiccan cook with the same type of stuff. But generally speaking, a lot of what people are doing in the mid-range Kitty Pryde space looks a lot like this. It involves cards like Captain Marvel, it involves tech cards, it involves Galacta. I've done a video on this list, so I won't go immensely in depth, but the basic thing you should understand is that this is a list that has a ton of good cards, a decent amount of ability to energy cheat, and while it doesn't have enough big power guys in it, it is able to easily manufacture those big power guys via the use of Galacta, and of course cards that move, and of course via leveraging the energy advantage that it can create with Penny Parker in order to play Galacta on 4 with a additional Kitty Pryde, which is effectively playing Galacta on 3. Similarly, you can leverage your Hope Summers in order to play more cards to make up for the fact that you don't have anything that's super big. Of course, you can also leverage Red Guardian and Shang-Chi in order to drag your opponent down to your level. Classic mid-range deck, and I think it's a good place to start while we explore what everyone is doing in Marvel Snap. Move Bounce is a genuinely strong deck, but the amount of weird things that you have to play around had me having one of the worst sessions I've had in a long time when I tried to play it. I am fairly convinced that some version of this deck is quite good. I am not 100% sold on Penny Parker being an important inclusion here. I get her in theory. You have the Penny Parker, which then allows you to move the card and then copy it with Frigga. That's really strong, but in practice, it feels like a lot of the time that's not necessarily the optimal thing to do. It's more of a plan C or D that is nice to have rather than something that's guaranteed. And of course, if you're playing something like that, you can also try to replace it with, a US Agent or Falcon, things like that. You can try to get the Agent Venom back in here, which I probably would not do. But again, there are things you can try to do to fiddle around with that slot. My experience with this deck suggests that I feel like long-term it is possible Penny ends up as an elite card in the list, but right now the deck feels like it's under pressure to go a little bigger than she allows you to do. You really don't necessarily get to go over the top of everything when you're doing Penny Frigga stuff. It's good, but you're not playing the deck to do that. And so I'm of two minds about her as a card in the deck. I will say this is I won't say it's impossible to play well. It's a very frustrating deck to play because of the variety of things that you can do to mess up. You cannot play around a Cosmo on the right lane. You cannot play around an Goliath on whatever lane. There's a lot of stuff you can do that is play aroundable. This deck will humble you, is my take. Because of everything we just talked about, Shadow King, in my opinion, is a bit of an underrated card right now. And finding a good shell for Shadow King is something that I've been working on. This list is an excellent shell for Shadow King because it uses it in multiple ways, and Shadow King is excellently good right now because we've talked about this. Galacta, Move Bounce, Penny Parker. There's a lot of green power in the game right now, and Shadow King is always, and has always been, one of the best possible ways to deal with that. This list is using the Affliction package in the Anti Venom shell, which a lot of people went away from, myself included, because it was so poor into mirrors. But with so much of mid-range being taken up by Galactus stuff like the first deck we talked about, or Wiccan, which we'll get to, there's going to be like 4 Wiccan decks in this episode, those decks do not have a lot of room for Luke Cage. And now that Anti Venom is no longer the dominant mid-range strategy, there's a lot less Luke Cage running around to beat up your Luke Cage reliant stuff. This, in turn, allows a deck that is focused on Affliction to actually thrive. The metagame is right for this to actually make sense. That's a good thing for anyone looking for a good home for Shadow King, because this deck gets to use it both ways, for giving the card back its power off of Anti Venom, and for defensively reducing things like Vulture and Dagger and Human Torch all the way down to 0. This list comes from Skada, who I encountered when he was rank 2 on ladder. It has adapted Surtur to the lack of Typhoid Mary, which, for the record, is another point in favor of being a loot cage deck, because this deck used to play Typhoid Mary loot cage some of the time, but now it's not worth doing that, meaning there's even less loot cage in the meta, hence even more value for the Afflict. But as you can see, what's been added here is, of course, the pseudo Mockingbird package. There's no Mockingbird in here, but you have Mysterio Sasquatch. You wish Mockingbird still had 10 power when you look at a deck like this. It is interesting how much this deck has become a deck that just effectively is running the Mockingbird package without Mockingbird. I'm not saying you need to go out and get a Mockingbird to put it in here. I think the list is too tight for that, but man, you really feel the lack of that card being 10 power, and I do think that if it were 10 power, this deck would be by far the best in the game. Absolutely busted, completely disgusting. The other thing that's important about this deck is it is very vulnerable to Mobius and Mobius, which basically nobody is playing. This is a deck that relies very heavily on going, here's a dude, here's a 10, here's a 10, here is a 10 and a 10 on the final turn of the game, or here is a Shadow King and a 10 on the final turn of the game. We've already had a bit of our discussion about Shadow King, so I don't really need to go in depth on why points plus Shadow King is good, but this deck has the same advantages: points plus Cosmo, points plus Shadow King, really dangerous final turn stuff. Just a very straightforward, basic, this should make sense to you. We're doing things that put points on the board, and then our final turn is usually either a free or 2-cost 10 power guy alongside a relevant tech card or another 10 power guy. That's the deck. Wiccan decks that include Penny Parker have been including more 5-drops, because sometimes you're on the Penny plan and ramping into a 5-drop is really what you're trying to do. This one uses Blink. I'm not sure who innovated it, but I really do enjoy it as a way of just getting more power into the deck. Being able to blink into your big, enormous 6-drops is really important. One of the things that Wiccan decks like this suffer from, though, is a general lack of the ability to interact in a meaningful way. This deck is actually just points. It doesn't look like it's just points, but it is just points. It has a similar role in most matchups to every other just points deck. And that's sort of the issue with Wiccan as a whole. There are 2 ways to try to build this deck, and the first is like this, where you just say, look, I don't have Shang-Chi, I don't have Shadow King, maybe you'll play around them, but if you don't, and you can go over the top of me, I'm gonna lose. Or you can try to include things like Shang-Chi and Shadow King, or Red Guardian, who I think is an excellent substitute if you're missing either Speed or Copycat, and might be better than either of them, frankly. But the general shape of what this deck is trying to do is very much just, here's some numbers. And frankly, when you play a deck like this, if it goes well, your numbers are going to be very high, and you won't notice the fact that you don't have a ton of interaction. But there's worlds where, like, this deck ends up being, like, subpar point output discard, right? Where it's like, okay, well, you don't have any interaction, and you're just putting out a bunch of points, and if your opponent can go over the top of those, they can beat you unless they're scared and playing around the interaction. And I think a deck like this gets a lot of value from people who are scared and playing around the interaction, because they don't know that you're not playing any of that stuff. It is entirely possible. Whereas if you're playing a discard deck, they know once you've Modoc'd what you're doing. Your whole thing is face up. That said, this deck does take a fairly similar posture to discard, as weird as it is to say. There's not tech cards in here, it's kind of just stuff. Maybe you'll be able to scam them with a Copycat or a Legion, but that's kind of your only options if someone's able to go over the top of you. This is another option in that same vein. I'm including it here to demonstrate a relative depth in terms of what Wiccan strategies are doing. I didn't want to just talk about Quicksilver Wiccan. I think this is also worth talking about. A special note, I believe Sandrocan is still near the top 10 with a Domino Wiccan deck running 3 1-drops using Domino to make that a little bit more likely to see them on 1. I think that's a really cool thing to do, but I do not have enough experience with or against it to put it on the tier list. It is worth mentioning in the context of different ways to build Wiccan. This one is looking to be a Wiccan Galacta deck, fairly straightforward. It is over-indexing for that stuff, and because you want to be a Zabu deck, because you want to be an Agony deck, it is trying to be a different type of Wiccan deck, a type of Wiccan deck that got phased out a while ago, a Wiccan deck without Quicksilver. This deck, same posture. Points, 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 points. We do not interact with anybody. We have no ability to do that. If they get outpointed, we get run over, but people might be afraid that we have the ability to interact. Similar posture, your Wiccans are, in my opinion, a bit less reliable. The 1 Quicksilver, 4 2-drops thing, especially when those 2-drops include Penny Parker and, of course, Kate Bishop, has proven fairly reliable for Wiccan, whereas this stuff has proven a little less, but it does have explosive power both with and without the card. For those willing to go a little bit more off the beaten path, the Dino Wiccan deck is also perfectly acceptable, in my opinion, as far as Wiccan decks go that look a little bit different from the ones that are typically being played. I think this is as good as Devil Dinosaur has been in a very long time. I appreciate that it's a good Mystique deck. I still have the back of my mind wonders, where is this supposed to be an Anti Venom deck? Can we try to get Anti Venom in? Is that a better thing to do with this deck than Wiccan, given we're playing Gore, given we're playing Devil Dinosaur, given we're playing Mystique, all of which are amazing targets for Anti Venom? I think that is entirely possible, and it is a direction I may want to explore, but for now, it's a little bit safer to use the Wiccan shell as a base here, and so you have this baseline good deck that can do something that other Wiccan decks are typically unable to do, and that is go freakishly tall, multiple Gores, absolutely terrifying, even multiple Devil Dinosaurs. Devil Dinosaur is an underratedly big card. People talk about like how Red Hulk gets to like, oh, Red Hulk, it's 16 power. Dude, Devil Dinosaur can be 17 and it costs 5. So I do think that people underrate exactly how big that guy can be too. You even get to play some little priority matchups where you're like, oh, well, I'm going to play a bunch of cards face down if I don't have priority, and then they're going to put power into the Devil Dinosaur because they add cards to my hand, and then that way I can dodge a Shang-Chi. There's some cool stuff that this deck gets to do that very few other decks are able to have access to. Arishem is around. I see a lot of people saying, oh, the nerf didn't do anything. Oh, the nerf didn't make him worse. I don't know. I saw people getting on other content creators for saying Arishem was nerfed because like they were like, oh, he's clearly been buffed. And it's like, my impression of this deck is that it is a little worse than it used to be. It meaningfully so. When I look at the stats on Untapped, there are not a lot of Arishem decks that are massively standing out. I think a couple of things have proven to be true about the archetype. One is that you want to play Valentina now. That's kind of locked in. And the second one is I am starting to favor Thanos Arishem over traditional Arishem because of that early game issue that you can run into, and because Thanos Arishem is a little bit better, and by a little bit I mean like honestly a lot, at getting Mockingbird out. And I think that's a more important part of what this deck is trying to do now. Be a Mockingbird deck, be able to explode onto the board. I see a lot of people acting like this deck did not take a nerf. And I think that if you were to look at like aggregate numbers, Arishem's win rate, I suspect it will have gone down by a notable amount. The deck is a little worse in a clear way. I don't think the deck is dead, but I also don't think that another deck with this level of performance would be being played as much as this one is. Arishem is a deck that will be played a lot, even if it's not the single best choice, for a variety of reasons, so it is still worth it to be prepared. The inclusion of Fenris Wolf in discard honestly escaped me for a little bit, but having played against it with Gambit and Moon Knight in the deck, it's pretty good. Like, this is a deck that you're not reinventing the wheel when you play discard, but I think discard is actually fairly well positioned right now with one major issue. The well-positionedness comes from the fact that there are a lot of those Wiccan decks that we talked about, where it's just like, I don't have tech, I'm just points. Good discard draws just beat that. Good discard draws just straight up beat all of those I don't have tech Wiccan decks. They just win. You just do more points than them. Your numbers are bigger. They don't have tech, you win. And that's where things get a little bit dicey, because the way that gets flipped on you is they Red Guardian your Dracula and you massively eat shit. And so this deck, I do think that if you're going to be playing one of those Wiccan techless decks, this deck is probably just as good at doing points. It's less cool, it's more face up, but it's probably just as good at doing the points that you're doing in one of those Wiccan techless decks. The major issue is, oh my god, it's so bad when your Dracula gets Red Guardian. Like, oh my god. And I personally, I know I've been showing a bunch of different lists, I think that if you're playing a Wiccan deck right now, take out whatever 3-drop, put in Red Guardian. He is just that good. He is effectively a tech slot that you get for free because he's a 3/5. Just play the card. I'm begging you. And that, in turn, me begging you to do that, that's bad for discard too. I've seen some cool stuff happening in the Surfer space recently, and that mostly has involved the removal of Killmonger, the removal of Nova, and the inclusion of Zabu and an additional 3-drop to get some more beef in there. I cannot be sure that this is the right thing to do, but I can tell you that statistically, in top 10% Infinite, this list outperforms the Killmonger Nova version. I have made one change. I am running Red Guardian over Cassandra Nova. You can feel free to make that swap the other way. If you're seeing a lot of Arishem, Cassandra Nova into Absorbing Man is an absolute beast mode, F you, I win kind of play. It's extremely, extremely powerful, and it's only exacerbated by the fact that you are able to do that on the final turn of the game if you have your Hope Summers energy. Very strong thing to do. I'm not seeing a lot of Arishem. It's around, but not enough for me to run a specific tech card for it. Hence, Red Guardian, a much more generalized tech card that is able to access just, deal with things that I otherwise would not be able to deal with. I feel as though this deck is being pretty massively underplayed. When I went to look at the numbers since the patch in top 10% Infinite on Untapped, there was not a version of this deck that had more than 50 games played, which obviously that's not representative of everything, but it does seem like this deck deserves to be played more than it is. All the things that this deck does well are still so relevant. And even though we are in a metagame where there are some mid-range decks that are just like, I'm not going to be a Shang-Chi deck, I'm not going to be a Shadow King deck anymore, I feel like we're getting back to mid-range decks that want to be Shang-Chi Shadow King decks, like the one at the beginning of the video, or like the Ajax one that we talked about. This kind of stuff is so damn strong against Shang-Chi Shadow King decks, the Alioth stuff, the Cosmos stuff. It's a great way of punishing that. And while I do think it's possible that maybe this wasn't the optimal move list to be playing, maybe you'd rather be playing Move Bounce or something, I get it. This one is such a dangerous deck to play against, especially the more people are playing like things to interact with your move stuff, the worse off they are when you're a Cosmo moving Alioth gamer. Goon Knight has been trending down a little bit as the Arishem Thanos play rate has mostly gone pretty significantly lower than it was at last week. I keep seeing people talking about like, oh, Arishem Thanos, people are still playing that all the time. And it's like, look, if they are, play this. This will beat the crap out of them. This will ruin their entire lives. You basically cannot beat this deck as Arishem Thanos. And I realize, I'm doing card gamer hyperbole here, but the matchup is like 65-35, 70-30 in favor of this deck. And that's not just because it is a Darkhawk Cassandra Nova deck. It is also because it is a discard deck, a deck that discards your opponent's stuff. And even more now than ever, because Agent Coulson is leaving these decks, it is so crucial for an Arishem player to have cards in hand in order to play. Hopefully good cards that are relevant and not garbage that they randomly generated. And this deck between Moon Knight and Black Bolt is able to like get some really meaningful damage into them. I think that this deck is the number one. If you're someone who's still mad about Arishem, go play this. You'll be fine. You will beat them to death all the time. 75% of the time, 65% of the time, whatever. Don't hold me to that. There are a couple contenders for Scream here. We talked a couple weeks ago about the gamer with the capital R build of this with Negasonic and Daredevil that I really enjoyed. There is a sort of renaissance of that build right now that's happening. It involves a Titania, but otherwise is basically the same deck. I think it's pretty close to being as good as this one is, but I'm still going to talk about the traditional one because you're just going to see more of this. And there's some like nuances here, like, there instead of the Shang-Chi, you might see like a Luna Snow or whatever. But this deck is really basically what it's always been. It is a Scream deck that is looking to combine the scams and the Scream and then have enough power to beat the crap out of you at the end of the game. And I do think that Scream has become, in my opinion, one of the most underrated cards in Marvel Snap. I don't think people understand what an accomplishment it is to just be a positive win rate mid-range engine on this tier list since release. That's a really, really legitimate accomplishment. I think that really demonstrates how far above expectations the card has been punching. I don't remember a lot of people saying Scream would be a consistent performer in the way that she was. I don't think I said that Scream would be a consistent performer like this, but she has been just good. Just straight up good at her job. And that is something that is worth respecting, I think. This deck is not ever probably going to be the single best mid-range deck in the game. But considering how relatively inflexible it is and how sort of telegraphed it is, it's a genuine accomplishment to take a deck full of cards that are generally not that great and make it this good. Husky Pile has been a bit on the downswing. This is still my preferred build of it, the Black Swan and various one-drops explosion of power on the final turn of the game build. But I will say that I no longer consider this as good as I did last week. Last week, you probably could have convinced me this is one of the better decks in the game. This week, I think it's strong enough. You'll be able to do stuff when your draws are good, but there's a lot of really consistent Juggernaut decks out there right now, and this deck is not great into those unless you can take Priority and Eliath and stuff. And then if you take Priority, it's like, okay, well, they have a Shang-Chi. There's just kind of a lot where there's a lot of these weird mid-rangey Juggernaut lists, and that matchup has not felt good to me at all. And all of the stuff you do is cool, but less relevant now than it has been in previous metagames. I had a hell of a time trying to play Move Bounce. It's a very difficult deck. I suspect it would be much easier for even someone of my level to climb with Normal Bounce, but Normal Bounce has some notable downsides, like a relatively lower point ceiling, and that lower point ceiling can mean that decks that would otherwise be an incredibly favored matchup, like those Wiccan decks without tech, are actually liable to outpower you. Normal Bounce is, I think, on balance, probably 55% of the time going to be higher power than those decks, but it does need actual good draws for that to happen, and the rest of the time you're going to be in the game, but not necessarily overpoweringly winning the way a good draw from a Move Bounce deck could. It's a question of ceiling. If you want to be having these incredible bully snaps with Move Bounce, that's going to be a better option for you. If you want to be in more games guaranteed and just have a lot of games where you are staying until turn 6, this might be a better choice. I have not seen a non-Arishem Thanos deck that is overwhelmingly convincing to me. Now, that is not necessarily to say that there isn't one. I've been hearing good things about the Surtur build with Marvel Boy. I've been hearing good things about a lot of different possible packages that can go in there. But I cannot confirm or deny that any of them are actually all that good. My instinct is that there may be something with Thanos, and I do think it's possible that we get towards it and figure it out. My instinct is also that it has not been figured out yet, and that this is the list that you're gonna see the most of, this or something like it. It has some real upsides, some really dangerous snap potential. It has some real downsides. Psylocke Wiccan is not overwhelmingly consistent if you don't open with a 1-drop in your hand, and your 1-drops are all stones. There's nothing objectively wrong with this deck. Even if I think it's like a little bit on the lower end, it's still a deck that's going to be like 50% win rate or higher, and that's fine. But I do wonder if Thanos is able to bring something else to bear and make this deck... I wonder if there's a version of it that's like actually actively amazing. It feels possible to me, and it hasn't felt possible for a while, so optimistic for Thanos. Still rocking the Denish Hela build. I am almost wanting to include Silver Samurai in here. It does seem like a really cool thing to do with gore. But as is, this is just the same list that I have been using as far as Hela goes, if I ever get that itch, which is extremely, extremely rare, full disclosure. But it's also the list that I think most people are going to be playing. Most things you'd expect to see when you play against a Hela list are going to be this. And I think that means it's worth talking about. One of the things that this list has going for it compared to regular Hela is that there are so many games in which you are genuinely like a 33% chance to win or a 50% chance to win off of like, a Gambit hit or a Ghost Rider that might pull back a Hela. All of that stuff is where the skill in this deck is. It's all just gambling and understanding odds and understanding expected value and like, okay, if I'm 33% to win, am I supposed to, I'm supposed to stay for X amount of cubes. Maybe I'm supposed to snap for X amount of cubes. Again, the math of this, the back end math is almost more important than your actual gameplay. But I will also say, this is actually a pretty tricky deck to play. Like, I realize a lot of people think Hela stuff is very easy, and it kind of is, but there's setups that really matter here. Like, what does your lane look like if you're going to try to Odin something? Are you able to do that? How do I play my cards in such a way that my Hela brings back the cards the way I need them? Because without Luke Cage in the deck, you are not an overpowering Hela deck all of the time. The other thing this deck does is with Corvus Glaive, you can actually just like play a ramp strategy. It's not going to be great. You're going to be vulnerable to tech and stuff, but you can do it. And I think that the ways in which this deck is able to win without the card Hela are what set it apart. I think you guys could probably expect this one, actually, because we've done so much talking about how the tech cards are not being played in a lot of these Wiccan decks, right? And so the ones that are being played are typically, you know, Shang-Chi's, maybe a Shadow King, which is relevant here, but like, there's not a lot of this stuff that really takes a dump on Mr. Negative. There's not a lot of Mobius in the metagame. There's almost no Enchantress. There's not a lot of Rogue. And that means that Mr. Negative is actually a pretty functional choice right now, where it is the kind of deck where if you want to be having that like move bounce kind of matchup against these techless Wiccan decks and just run them over, you want to be having that move bounce kind of matchup against these discard decks and just run them over, your nut draw is going to beat all those decks. Like, just straight up, you're just going to win whenever you do the Jane Foster after Mr. Negative stuff. You just win. It's just that good. And so having that in your back pocket, having all of these matchups where you just know that if you do the thing that your deck is built to do, you're going to win. They're not going to be able to go big enough to beat you, and they don't really have the tech cards that are able to stop you either. And the key thing when you play this deck is to not get too caught up in making that assumption. You got to think about, like, you know, why is my opponent staying here? Can I lose to a Juggernaut? Can I lose to a Cosmo? What are the odd offbeat things that can get me here? Maybe a Red Guardian, right? Like, it's not an amazing deck still, but the metagame is right for combo stuff like this to make sense. And Mr. Negative is a very good deck in those contexts. You could also try things like Phoenix Force, but I think those are a little more vulnerable to the Shadow King stuff. And so you have a deck that throws priority and then just explodes onto the board and is able to play enough cards that maybe it doesn't get vulnerable to Juggernaut. There's powerful stuff here. I think this deck has a real shot at success right now in a way that it hasn't had in a couple of months. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Let me know what you think about the tier list in the comments. And of course, I do have one last thing to say, and that is, I know there's a lot of decks with Hydro Bob. I'm sorry. It's my job to tell you what the best decks are. He's in a lot of the best decks. He's a really good card. I'm sorry.